The gratitude tithe is due. Commander Eva Rostova stood on the bridge of the Terran fleet ship Judgment. The air recycled 1,000,000 times tasted of ozone and cold resolve. Before her, the main holographic display showed the Vexian Arbitrator-class vessel, a predator carved from obsidian and arrogance. Its demand blinked in sterile universal script across the lower third of the screen, a demand that was both an invoice and an insult. At stake were the 20,000 souls on the cradle ship Horizon, a civilian vessel the Judgment had just saved from a plasma field. Now their savior's saviors had arrived to collect a fee. They have the right of salvage assist. Lieutenant Jian Li said, his voice tight. But this is extortion. Ava's eyes narrowed. The Vex operated under a legal framework they called the Doctrine of Imposed Obligation. It was a parasitic code of law designed to bleed the grateful. They would use this encounter to establish a precedent, a new collar on human expansion. The coming confrontation would not be fought with weapons, but in a forum of public inquiry, a star court of galactic opinion. Humanity's first true test among the stars would be a trial. Their only acceptable victory was one written in law. Fleet Mind Eva said, her voice a low command that cut through the bridge's hum. Project the Horizon's gratitude transcript. Full public channel. The ship's integrated intelligence magister responded instantly. Its synthesized voice was calm, a stark contrast to the tension coiling in the human crew. Acknowledged, Commander. Broadcasting the unedited civilian logs, the Vex will see their faces, hear their voices. A wave of holographic windows bloomed around the main display, each showing a family, a child, an elder from the Horizon, their tearful thanks echoing a genuine relief the Vex now sought to monetize. The lead Vexian ship, the Gilded Scale, did not respond with words. It simply amplified its initial demand, the blinking text growing larger, more insistent. It was a classic power play, an attempt to frame the humans as ungrateful debtors in the court of galactic observation. Eva knew their strategy intimately. The Vex did not conquer with fleets. They conquered with contracts, with clauses buried so deep in gratitude that they became shackles. They were lawyers with warships. They turned rescue into a racket. They're citing the Provisional Aid Mandate. Article 7, Jian announced, his fingers flying across his console. It allows for the levying of a proportional gratitude tithe for unscheduled assistance rendered outside sovereign territory. Proportional to what Eva countered, her gaze fixed on the Vexian ship. The value of the lives saved. The cost of their fuel. Their wounded pride that we arrived first. Magister's voice joined the conversation, cool and analytical. Their calculation is based on projected lifetime economic output of all 20,000 colonists, Commander. They have assessed the value of the Horizon at approximately 400 trillion standard credits. The tithe is 10%. A stunned silence fell over the bridge. 40 trillion credits. It was a sum designed to be impossible, a debt that could only be paid in servitude. This was the collar doctrine in its purest form. This was how they enslaved worlds without firing a shot. A young ensign near the tactical station let out a low whistle, quickly stifled. The scent of coffee, suddenly sharp, cut through the recycled air. Jian Eva ordered, her tone hardening into steel. Record every nanosecond of this, every transmission, every flicker of their running lights. We are building a case. She turned her head slightly. Magister, what is the Vexian legal standing for this claim under the broader Galactic Concordat Precarious Commander? The AI replied. The Concordat prioritizes life over property. However, the Vex have successfully argued in 12 prior rulings that a sovereign entity's future potential is property. They have won by default, when their opponents could not pay the initial filing fees for a formal challenge. That was the trap. The Vex used the law as a weapon, but they made sure the courthouse door was too heavy for anyone else to open. They built their empire on the fine print. Eva felt a cold anger settle in her gut. This fleet, her command, was different. This saintship teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. A new debt is a new kind of chain. Then we will not challenge their filing fee, Eva declared, a new strategy forming in her mind. We will pay it. But we will do it in a way they do not expect. She looked at her communications officer. Hailing frequency audio only to the gilded scale. Address it to their arbiter. Channel open, Commander. Arbiter of the gilded scale. Ava began, her voice resonating with carefully controlled calm. This is Commander Rostova of the Terran ship Judgment. We acknowledge receipt. We are prepared to remit the standard concordate filing fee for a public inquiry into this matter. Please confirm your designated receiving node. The reply was almost immediate, dripping with a synthesized condescension that grated on the ear. Commander Rostova, your promptness is noted. A species so young in the galaxy, yet you understand the fundamentals of obligation. The node is confirmed. We await your payment. The Vexian thought they had won. They believed the humans would bankrupt themselves just to be heard. But Eva had no intention of sending credits. Magister, she murmured, her lips barely moving. Prepare the data package, not our financial reserves. The other ledger, the one we prepared for this exact contingency. Calculating the AI confirmed. The package contains 200 years of uncompensated Terran aid, disaster relief, and technological seeding provided to fledgling species, all calculated at Concordat-approved rates. Cross-referenced with Vexian non-participation records. The value exceeds their filing fee by a factor of 12. A slow smile touched Eva's lips. It was a legal gambit, a mirror justice maneuver in its infancy. The Vex had built an empire on the concept of gratitude as a commodity. It was time to show them what a genuine ledger of goodwill looked like, and to use it as a key to the courtroom they so arrogantly controlled. Their law was a cage. Ours would be the key. On the bridge of the gilded scale, Arbiter Vask watched the Terran data packet arrive. It was not the expected string of financial authorizations. It was a meticulously compiled archive, a testament to a species' outward-facing generosity. Each entry was a verifiable act of aid, from delivering atmospheric processors to a choking colony to sharing agricultural breakthroughs with a famine-stricken world. Each was time-stamped, audited, and valued. Insolence, Vask hissed, its multipartite jaw clicking. They think to pay us with sentiment. Its legal aid, a lesser Vex named Krell, shimmered at its side. Arbiter, the data is compliant with Concordat protocols for non-monetary asset set transfer. Their ledger is robust. If we refuse it, they can petition for a default judgment against us for negotiating in bad faith. Vask's appendages tightened. The humans were not behaving like any species it had encountered. They were not begging, nor were they rattling sabers. They were quoting statutes. They were using the Vex's own tools against them, turning the labyrinthine legal code of the Concordat into a weapon of their own. This was not a simple shakedown. It was becoming a duel of jurisprudence. Accept the transfer, Vask commanded, its voice a low rasp. Let them have their inquiry. They will find the court of public opinion is far more expensive than they imagine. We will bury them in procedural motions and expert witness fees. Their precious ledger will be exhausted before the first testimony is heard. The Vex believed the game was still theirs to control. They saw the humans as clever primitives aping the motions of galactic law without understanding its true brutal calculus. This was their second mistake. Their first had been sending the invoice. A debt of gratitude is paid with respect, not gold. Aboard the Horizon, the civilian colonists watched the unfolding drama with a mix of fear and hope. In a small cabin, a hydroponics engineer named Lena held her daughter Ilara, trying to explain the silent ballet of warships outside their viewport. Ilara, only 7 years old, had seen the plasma field. She had felt the ship lurch as the Judgment's tractor beams had pulled them to safety. "The shiny ship saved us," Mama Ilara whispered, her small finger pointing at the sleek form of the Terran vessel. "Yes, sweetie." "They did," Lena said, stroking her daughter's hair. "But the dark ship is angry," Ilara observed. "Why is it angry?" Lena's throat tightened. How could she explain galactic extortion to a child? "The dark ship. They think we owe them something for being saved. They want to send us a bill." Ilara's brow furrowed in confusion. "But a rescue is a gift. You don't pay for a gift. You just say thank you." Lena hugged her daughter close, the simple, profound truth of the child's words echoing in her heart. That was the core of it, the human principle that the Vex could never comprehend. It was a principle Eva Rostova was now preparing to defend in a forum where such ideas were seen as a quaint, exploitable weakness. The fight was not for credits. It was for the very definition of civilization. The universe remembers who answers the call. The public inquiry was set. The venue was not a physical court, but a designated subspace channel, the Aurora Court, overseen by a neutral adjudicator from the machine intellect consensus. Millions of species across the galaxy could now tune in. The Vex had intended to make an example of humanity. Eva intended to do the same to them. She stood with her team in the Judgment's briefing room, the walls displaying the flow of legal arguments and potential Vex countermoves. "They will attack our standing first," Gian said, pointing to a highlighted flowchart. "They will argue that as a non-concordant signatory species, our ledger of aid is irrelevant. They'll call it a unilateral, unenforceable declaration of value." "They are correct," Magister stated from a nearby speaker. "According to precedent, our actions, however benevolent, carry no legal weight, as they were not performed under a recognized mutual obligation framework." "Then we won't argue that they do," Eva replied, her eyes scanning the complex legal web. "We are not presenting our ledger as a payment to the Vex. We presented it as the filing fee to the court itself. We paid the court in the currency of verifiable galactic contribution. It is the adjudicator who must now rule on its validity, not the Vex." This was the first pillar of her strategy: to shift the argument away from a bilateral dispute into a question of fundamental concordant principles. Was the court's authority derived from financial power or from a broader concept of communal good? The Vex had always operated as if the former were true. Eva was about to force the question into the light. A question of law is a question of character. The inquiry began. The adjudicator, a crystalline entity designated Arbiter Prime 7, manifested as a being of pure geometric light in the center of the virtual chamber. Its voice was a chorus of synthesized tones, perfectly neutral, utterly impartial. The Vex, represented by Arbiter Vask, appeared as a towering robed hologram, its face a mask of serene authority. Eva chose to appear as herself in her Terran fleet uniform, standing alone. Vask spoke first, its voice smooth and practiced. "Honored adjudicator, esteemed galactic audience. The Vex Imperium stands here today to affirm a simple foundational principle of civilized space that a service rendered carries a value and that this value constitutes a debt. The Terrans in their youthful exuberance seem to believe that sentiment can substitute for substance. We are here merely to collect what is owed as per the Provisional Aid Mandate, a law they now seek to subvert. It was a powerful opening, framing the Vex as upholders of order and the humans as naive newcomers trying to shirk their responsibilities. The court of public opinion Ava knew would be swayed by such confident pronouncements. Now it was her turn. Honored adjudicator Eva began, her voice steady and clear. We are not here to subvert the law. We are here to clarify it. The Vex have presented an invoice for a rescue. We contend that what they are charging for is not the act of rescue itself, but the opportunity to indebt a species. Their claim is not based on cost, but on a predatory valuation of future lives. She paused, letting the words sink in. The Concordat was founded to promote mutual support and prevent exploitation. The Vex doctrine of imposed obligation uses the language of the Concordat to achieve the opposite. We are not challenging a bill. We are challenging a business model. You cannot invoice a conscience. Vask's hologram flickered slightly, a sign of its irritation. The Terran commander speaks of motives and models. Let us speak of facts. The Horizon and its 20,000 colonists were in imminent danger. Vexian assets were diverted to provide aid. That is a fact. A cost was incurred. That is a fact. The mandate allows for proportional remuneration. That is the law. Where is the controversy? The controversy, Eva retorted, is in the word proportional. The Vex calculate this proportion based on their own assessment of our colony's future earnings. They have in effect claimed a 10% stake in every child, every invention, every dream born on the horizon for the next century. This is not remuneration. This is ownership. She then turned her attention to the silent galactic audience. To all listening species, I ask you to consider this. If your ship is stranded, do you want the first vessel that arrives to be a savior or an assessor? Do you want a hand extended in help, or one holding a contract and a pen? The public feed, which displayed anonymized viewer sentiment, began to shift. The initial wave of support for the established Vex had begun to erode. Eva was not just arguing her case. She was holding up a mirror to the entire galaxy, forcing them to see the reflection of the Vex's methods and wonder if they might be next. A mirror shows you what you are not, what you own. Magister's voice spoke softly in Eva's private comms link. Commander sentiment analysis shows a 17% shift in our favor among unaligned worlds. Vex-aligned worlds are holding firm. The adjudicator has just requested the Vex submit their detailed cost-benefit analysis for the rescue. This was a small victory. The adjudicator was not dismissing the case. It was asking for evidence. It was treating the human argument as credible. The Vex would have prepared for this, of course. They would have a mountain of data charts and projections to justify their 40 trillion credit figure. Eva needed to be ready for the data war that was to come. Gian, get our econometrics team ready, she ordered quietly. I want them to run a parallel analysis, not on the Horizon's value, but on the cost to the Vex. Fuel, manpower, risk assessment, everything. Let's see what their actual expense was. Aye, Commander, came the reply. Team is already on it. Preliminary estimate is significantly less than 40 trillion. I know, Eva said, but we need to prove it. We need to show the galaxy the difference between what they spent and what they are demanding. That difference is the true measure of their greed. The core of the human strategy was becoming clear. They would not argue that a debt was not owed. They would argue that the debt claimed was fraudulent. They were turning a legal hearing into a forensic accounting audit live on the Galactic stage. Some truths are told on a balance sheet. Back in the virtual court, Vask presented its case. A cascade of complex infographics filled the space showing projected resource extraction from the Horizon's target planet, patentable technologies, trade route potentials. It was a dazzling display of economic forecasting, all designed to inflate the colony's value to an astronomical figure. The Vex argued that by saving the ship, they had saved this entire future profit stream and were thus entitled to a share. As you can see, Vask concluded with an air of unassailable logic. Our claim of 400 trillion in total value is, if anything, a conservative estimate. Our 10% tithe is more than reasonable. It is generous. Eva waited for the presentation to end. She did not try to debunk their figures directly. That would lead to a battle of competing experts, a quagmire of speculation. Instead, she took a different path. Arbiter Vask has presented a compelling vision of the Horizon's future. Eva began her tone respectful. A future of prosperity and growth. It is a future we believe in as well. But this vision is irrelevant to the matter at hand. The provisional aid mandate allows for remuneration for costs incurred. It does not grant the rescuer a venture capital stake in the rescued. She gestured, and a single simple data slate appeared in the virtual space. It was stark and minimalist compared to the Vex's gaudy presentation. Here are the Vex's costs. Our analysis based on public records of their ship's capabilities and standard concordant operational rates calculates their total expenditure for this rescue operation. The number appeared on the slate. It was 93 million credits. The Vex have sent us an invoice for 40 trillion credits, Eva stated, her voice ringing with clarity, for a service that cost them 93 million. That is a markup of over 43 million%. We ask the court, and the galaxy, is this the behavior of a rescuer, or is it the behavior of a predator? A single number can be the loudest voice in the room. A ripple of stunned silence moved through the public channel. The sheer naked disparity between the two figures was devastating. Eva had ignored the Vex's speculative fantasy and anchored the entire debate to a single verifiable fact. She had reframed the argument from one of abstract value to one of concrete, provable fraud. The Vex were not just being accused of being greedy, they were being accused of being liars. Vask's hologram shimmered more intensely. This is an outrage, a simplistic, insulting analysis so the Terrans ignore the risk to our vessel, the strategic redeployment of assets, the opportunity cost. Our calculations are complex, validated by decades of precedent. Then show them to us, Eva challenged, her voice like ice. Open your books. Show this court the detailed line-by-line accounting that transforms 93 million into 40 trillion. The Concordat Charter on Transparency requires it in any disputed claim exceeding 1 billion credits. Unless, of course, you wish to withdraw the claim, she had them. It was a legal pincer move. Either the Vex revealed their proprietary predatory algorithms for all to see, exposing their business model to the galaxy, or they would have to drop the case. They had built their empire in the shadows of fine print and incomprehensible contracts. Eva was dragging them kicking and screaming into the sunlight. The law is a light, and some creatures cannot bear it. For a long moment, the Vexian arbiter was silent. In its command center, Vask was locked in a frantic private communion with its superiors. The humans had not just challenged a single invoice. They had challenged the entire foundation of the Vex Imperium's economic power. To reveal their methods would be to arm every future victim. To retreat would be a public humiliation, a crack in the facade of their invincibility. Finally, Vask spoke, its voice strained. The Vex Imperium's assessment models are proprietary. They are the lifeblood of our economic stability. To reveal them would be an unacceptable security risk. So, you are refusing to comply with the Concordat Charter on Transparency. Eva pressed her tone relentless. We are not refusing, Vask countered. We are petitioning for a closed hearing on this specific matter to present the data directly to the adjudicator under a seal of absolute confidentiality. It was a clever move, an attempt to regain control of the narrative, to put the incriminating evidence back into the shadows. But Eva was ready. We object, she said firmly. This is a public inquiry. The debt is being claimed publicly. The defense must also be public. The 20,000 people on the horizon have a right to see the math that seeks to enslave their great-grandchildren. The galaxy has a right to see how a law intended to encourage rescue is being twisted into a tool of conquest. The truth has no need for a closed room, the adjudicator Prime 7 silent, until now pulsed with a soft blue light. Its choral voice filled the virtual space. The Terran commander's objection is sustained. The Concordat Charter is clear. In matters of public claim, transparency is paramount. Arbiter Vask, the court requires your compliance. You will submit your unredacted valuation algorithms for public review. It was a landmark ruling. The machine intellect had sided with the principle of openness over the Vex's appeal to secrecy. The momentum had shifted decisively. On the bridge of the judgment, a quiet cheer went up, which Eva silenced with a raised hand. This was not over. The Vex were cornered, and a cornered predator is at its most dangerous. Magister's voice came through her calm. Commander, I am detecting a massive energy surge from the gilded scale. It is not consistent with weapons activation. It appears to be a computational spike of unprecedented scale. What are they doing? Jian asked, his face pale. They are not preparing to fight. Eva murmured, her eyes fixed on Vask's rigid hologram. They are preparing to lie on a scale we can barely imagine. The Vex were not going to reveal their true algorithms. They were going to invent a new one, a fantastically complex, utterly fraudulent model, and generate terabytes of supporting data in real time. They would try to win by burying the court in a blizzard of weaponized mathematics, a denial-of-service attack on the truth itself. A lie told loudly enough becomes its own kind of truth. They're going to brute force the math, Eva said, the pieces clicking into place. Create a false logic so dense and convoluted that the adjudicator will have no choice but to accept it or declare the matter too complex to rule on. They'll force a mistrial. Can they do that? Lieutenant Lee asked aghast. Their computational capacity far exceeds ours. Magister confirmed, and the adjudicator is bound by logic. If a logical system is presented however complex, it must be evaluated. The Vex are attempting to weaponize complexity itself. This was the escalation. The Vex were moving beyond legal arguments and into pure informational warfare. Eva knew the judgment systems could not compete on that level. Magister was a powerful AI, but the Vex had dedicated worlds to computation. Trying to outcalculate them would be a fool's errand. A new plan was needed, one that did not rely on matching their processing power. If we can't win by checking their math, Eva said, thinking aloud, then we have to attack the premise. We have to prove not that their answer is wrong, but that their question is invalid. She looked to her AI. Magister, pull up every Concordat ruling related to the definition of sentient potential. I want to find the source code of their argument. The flaw is never in the answer. It is in the question. While Magister sifted through centuries of legal text, a civilian vignette played out on one of the secondary bridge screens. It was a live feed from the Horizons schoolroom. A teacher was trying to conduct a lesson on galactic history, but the children were distracted, their faces turned towards the viewport showing the distant silent ships. One small boy was drawing on a datapad. He had drawn the judgment as a shining angel, and the gilded scale as a dark, tangled knot. The teacher knelt beside him. "What's that, Leo?" "It's the bill," Leo said, pointing at the knot. "My dad says it's all tangled up so we can't ever get loose." The innocence of the child's drawing struck Eva with the force of a physical blow. The knot. That was what the Vex were creating. A knot of logic so tight, so complex that it could never be unraveled. But every knot has a starting point, a single thread from which the whole tangled mess originates. She had to find that thread and pull it. Commander Magister announced, its voice cutting through her thoughts. "I have isolated a foundational precedent. The sanctity of potential ruling of Cycle 4.2. It was a case involving a non-sentient but biologically complex organism. The court ruled that its potential to evolve into a sentient species could be considered a quantifiable asset." "That's it," Eva breathed. "That's their cornerstone. They took a ruling about a pre-sentient fungus and applied it to a colony of living, breathing people. It is a gross misapplication of the legal principle." Commander Magister agreed. "But it has never been challenged." Until now, Eva said, a grim determination solidifying her features. "Communications get me back into the main inquiry. I have one more question for the Arbiter." Her hologram reappeared in the virtual court just as Vask was beginning to flood the chamber with impenetrable walls of equations. Streams of light representing data were swirling around the adjudicator, which seemed to be straining to process the onslaught. "You cannot hide a false principle behind a mountain of true facts." Arbiter Vask, Eva's voice cut through the storm of information. The data flow faltered for a moment. "I have a question for you. Not about your calculations, which are as impressive as they are opaque. My question's about your premise." Vask's hologram turned its expression unreadable. "Your questions are no longer relevant, Terran. We are providing the requested transparency. The matter is now one of pure computation. Are you familiar with the sanctity of potential ruling?" Eva asked, ignoring his deflection. The question hung in the air. It was a deep cut, a reference to a legal obscurity from centuries ago. It was the source code. The first thread of the knot. Vask's hesitation was almost imperceptible, but on the galactic stage it was a tremor that shook its entire case. "It is one of thousands of precedents," Vask said dismissively. "Its relevance is tangential." "On the contrary," Eva countered. "It is the bedrock of your entire financial empire, is it not? You have built a business model on the idea that a sentient being's future can be quantified and collateralized, just like a pre-sentient fungus. You treat people like a crop to be harvested." She turned to the adjudicator. "Honored adjudicator, we are no longer discussing a financial claim. We are here to discuss a fundamental question of rights. Does a sentient being have ownership of its own future? Or can that future be claimed by another as an asset, an entry on a ledger?" The Vex's entire case rests on the latter. We argue that this is not just illegal under the Concordat. It is slavery disguised in the language of economics. The word landed with the force of a plasma torpedo. Slavery. She had said it. She had named the ugly truth at the heart of the Vex doctrine. The blizzard of data ceased. The entire inquiry froze. The Vex were not just creditors anymore. They were slavers, and in the galactic community there was no greater crime. Some words are verdicts in themselves. The public sentiment index, which had been wavering, now plummeted for the Vex. Worlds that had been their allies for centuries began to register doubt, then alarm. Trade consortiums and mutual defense pacts began to flicker from green to amber on the galactic status boards. Ava had not just pulled the thread, she had set the entire tapestry on fire. Arbiter Vask was for the first time visibly shaken. Its hologram wavered, losing cohesion. This is slander. An inflammatory, baseless accusation. We are investors in potential, not traffickers in flesh. Then your investment is invalid, Eva shot back. Because potential is not property. A life is not a commodity. A dream is not an asset you can seize. This is the human position, and we believe it is the only civilized position. She looked directly at the glowing form of the adjudicator. We ask the court to dismiss the Vex's financial claim, and we formally petition for a broader inquiry into the legality of the doctrine of imposed obligation itself on the grounds that it violates the Concordat's foundational prohibition against sentient bondage. This was the ultimate gambit. She had escalated from defending against a single claim to launching a full-scale assault on the Vex's legal framework. It was a move that could either shatter their empire or bring the full wrath of its immense power down upon humanity. On the bridge of the judgment, no one dared to breathe. They were a single ship, a new species on the galactic block, and their commander had just picked a fight with a Titan. The cold, recycled air felt charged heavy with the weight of the future. The faint scent of coffee had been replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. A principle is only a principle if you are willing to fight for it. The Adjudicator Prime 7 pulsed slowly, its light shifting from blue to a deep, contemplative violet. The galactic audience held its collective breath. This was no longer about a rescue bill. This was a defining moment, a trial that would set the course of law and morality for generations. The machine mind was not just evaluating legal arguments, it was evaluating the character of two civilizations. Whose Vexian claim against the Terran vessel Horizon, the adjudicator's choral voice finally intoned, is hereby suspended. A collective sigh of relief went through the judgment's bridge. Furthermore, the adjudicator continued, the court recognizes the gravity of the Terran petition. A formal inquiry into the doctrine of imposed obligation, as practiced by the Vex Imperium, will be convened. All Vexian asset claims based on this doctrine across the galaxy are frozen pending the outcome of this inquiry. It was a staggering victory, more than Eva could have hoped for. She had not only saved the Horizon from a crippling debt, she had put the entire Vexian economic model on trial. She had fired a shot that would be heard in every corner of the galaxy, a shot fired not from a cannon, but from a law book. But as she watched the enraged, sputtering hologram of Arbiter Vask fade from the virtual court, Eva knew this was far from over. The Vex would not take this lying down. They had been publicly humiliated and financially neutered. Their response would be swift, and it would likely move beyond the courtroom. She had won the battle of the inquiry, but the war for the soul of galactic law had just begun. A ruling is not a victory, it is merely permission to continue the fight. The Vex did not simply vanish. The gilded scale and its two smaller escorts remained silent and immobile, their obsidian hulls drinking the starlight. On the bridge of the judgment, the brief moment of elation evaporated, replaced by a cold, watchful tension. A legal victory was only a piece of paper if the loser refused to leave the field. Ava Rostova felt the eyes of her crew upon her, their hope mingling with a new, sharper fear. They had won the argument. Now they had to survive the consequences. "They're not moving." Commander Jian Li stated, his voice a flat line of observation. "Their energy signatures are reconfiguring." shifting from computational output to shield projection. They are establishing a perimeter. Magister announced its synthesized voice devoid of emotion. A standard exclusionary mandate formation. They are preparing to blockade us. Before Ava could process the sheer audacity of the move, a new transmission arrived. It was not a demand or an invoice. It was a public broadcast sent on all concordant channels addressed to the galaxy at large. It was a formal declaration from the Vex Imperium, citing a little-known clause in the Galactic Health and Safety Protocols. They declared our ideas a contagion. The Terran vessel, Judgment Arbiter Vask's voice boomed, now stripped of all pretense of civility, has demonstrated itself to be a rogue legal entity. It has introduced a dangerous, destabilizing mimetic ideology into the galactic commons, the notion that established economic obligations can be nullified by emotional appeal. And this ideology represents a contagion of thought, a threat to the stability of interstellar commerce. Therefore, under the provisions of the Quarantine Compact, we are establishing a cordon sanitaire around the affected vessels to prevent further spread of this hazardous meme. This is not an act of aggression. It is an act of public hygiene. It was brilliant. It was diabolical. The Vex had been barred from using one legal doctrine, so they had simply picked up another. They were no longer creditors. They were now sanitizers protecting the galaxy from a dangerous human idea. They had reframed their illegal blockade as a legally justifiable quarantine. They were trapping the Judgment and the 20,000 civilians on the horizon behind a wall of sanctimonious law. They can't do that, Gian breathed, his knuckles white on his console. The adjudicator is still observing. This is a clear violation of the suspension ruling. It is not, Magister corrected gently. The ruling suspended their financial claim. It did not grant us protected passage. The Vex have initiated a new separate legal action. By the time the adjudicator convenes a hearing to challenge this quarantine, we will have been here for weeks. Their goal is not to win this new case. Their goal is to make our victory so painful that we capitulate on the original ruling. This was the Vex's true nature. They were not just predators. They were bullies. They would hold 20,000 civilians hostage in the void, not with weapons but with regulations. They would slowly starve them of hope, all under the color of law. Ava felt the cold anger return, but it was sharper now, honed to a razor's edge. A cage made of words is still a cage. On the horizon, the initial celebration had died. Fear, a cold and creeping thing, was seeping back into the corridors and cabins. Lena, the hydroponics engineer, held her daughter Ilara as they watched the Vex ships move into their blocking positions. The stars were being blotted out one by one. Are the bad ships leaving? Mama Ilara asked, her voice small. Lena's throat was too tight to speak. She could only shake her head. The promise of freedom had been snatched away. They were prisoners again, this time to a legal fiction. She looked at the dwindling power reserves on her personal datapad. The ship had not been prepared for a long standoff. The Vex knew that. They were counting on it. A waiting game is a cruel one when only one side has time to spare. What are our options? Magister Ava asked, her voice dangerously quiet. We have three, the AI replied. One, we attempt to break their blockade. They would be legally justified in using proportional force to stop us, making us the aggressors. 2. We wait for the adjudicator to rule on their quarantine. Projections indicate this will take a minimum of 3 standard weeks, during which the Horizon's life support systems will approach critical failure. 3. We capitulate. We agree to pay a reduced version of their original tithe in exchange for the quarantine being lifted. Gian slammed a fist onto his console. So we fight and lose weight and die or give in. That's not a choice. That's a death sentence in triplicate. It is a meticulously constructed legal trap, Magister stated. From a strategic standpoint, it is admirable. Eva stared at the holographic display, at the Vex ships arranged in their perfect, arrogant formation. They were expending a tremendous amount of energy to maintain the quarantine field, a shimmering wall of legal and physical intimidation. They were pouring power into her prison. And in that simple fact, an idea began to form. An idea so audacious, so exquisitely symmetrical, that it could have only been born from the strange fusion of human indignation and artificial intelligence. She turned to her AI. Magister, she said, a strange new light in her eyes. The Vex are providing us with a service, are they not? A single spark of logic can ignite a revolution. There was a fractional pause as the AI processed the seemingly absurd question. Commander, they are illegally detaining us. Yes, Eva agreed. But to do so, they are performing an action. They are projecting a field, maintaining a perimeter, providing containment, an unsolicited service, much like the one they claimed to have provided the horizon. Jian looked at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. Commander, what are you suggesting? I am suggesting, Eva said, her voice gaining strength, that we hold them to their own standard. The doctrine of imposed obligation states that a service rendered, even if unsolicited, carries a value and constitutes a debt. She looked at Magister. The Vex are performing a service. I want to send them an invoice. The bridge was utterly silent, save for the hum of the ship's systems. The sheer, glorious audacity of it was breathtaking. It was the legal equivalent of judo, of using an opponent's own weight against them. It was mirror justice in its purest, most weaponized form. Magister Eva commanded, her voice ringing with newfound purpose. Calculate the energy output of the Vex fleet in maintaining this quarantine. Cross-reference it with standard concordant rates for hazardous material containment services. Create a new public ledger visible to the entire galaxy. And start billing the Vex Imperium for the cost of our own imprisonment. Effective immediately. Their aggression would become their debt. Magister did not hesitate. The request, while unprecedented, was logically sound, within the twisted framework the Vex themselves had established. Calculation complete, the AI announced. A new public channel, Ledger of Reciprocal Obligation, is now live. The initial invoice for the first hour of containment services has been transmitted to the gilded scale and posted for Galactic review. On the main screen, a new window appeared. It was a simple, elegant ledger. On one side, it listed the Vex ships and their real-time energy expenditure. On the other, a number already in the millions of credits was ticking steadily upward. Every second, the Vex's bill grew larger. They were now paying for the very power they were using to trap the humans. Arbiter Vask's reaction was instantaneous and apoplectic. A furious private message blared over their comms. This is a mockery, a perversion of the law. You cannot invoice us for our own legal precautionary measures. Ava instructed her comms officer to patch her reply directly to the public channel for all to hear. Arbiter Vask, she said, her voice dripping with cold formality. We are merely applying the legal principle you hold so dear. You have imposed an obligation upon us, the obligation to remain here. We are now imposing the reciprocal obligation upon you, the obligation to pay for the service you are so generously providing. If you find the cost to be too high, you are of course free to cease providing the service at any time. She had not just turned their logic against them. She had turned it into a weapon, a real-time financial bleed that the entire galaxy could watch. The Vex had wanted a public stage for their power. Now they had one, but the play being performed was a tragedy of their own making. Some debts are paid in iron, others in irony. The galactic reaction was immediate and seismic. Beings who had been confused or intimidated by the Vex's legalese now understood perfectly. The humans were holding up a mirror, and the reflection was a monster being devoured by its own tail. The sentiment index, which had been static, began to move again, this time like an avalanche. Support for the Vex position collapsed. Laughter in 1,000 different forms of communication echoed across the interstellar networks. The Vex were not just being challenged. They were being ridiculed. On the gilded scale, Vask was in a state of controlled fury. Its aides scrambled, searching for a legal counter-argument, a precedent, a loophole. But they could find none. Every argument they could make against the humans' invoice was an argument that could be used against their own core doctrine. To deny this debt would be to invalidate every debt they had ever collected. They were trapped in a cage of their own design, and the bars were forged from their own greed. This changes nothing. Vask broadcast trying to regain the initiative. The quarantine remains. This financial theater is an amusing but irrelevant distraction. But it was not irrelevant. The numbers on the ledger continued to climb. Millions became tens of millions. Tens of millions were rapidly approaching a billion. The cost of maintaining the blockade was staggering. The Vex Imperium was powerful, but it was not infinitely wealthy. Eva had found their breaking point. Not their hulls, not their shields, but their treasury. The deepest wound is always to the purse. Days turned into a week. The tension was a living entity on the Judgment's bridge. The air was thick with the smells of recycled oxygen, lukewarm coffee, and human stress. The ledger continued its inexorable climb. The Vex were now trillions of credits in debt, a sum that was beginning to approach the value of their flagship. They held firm, their pride and their entire legal philosophy on the line. They could not back down, but they were bleeding credits at a rate that would cripple their empire for a decade. Aboard the horizon, the initial fear had been replaced by a grim, determined hope. They were rationing power and water, but they watched the public ledger as if it were a holy text. They saw the numbers climb, each new digit, a blow struck on their behalf. They were no longer just victims. They were witnesses to a reckoning. Ava watched her crew, saw the exhaustion in their eyes. This victory was costing them as well. The ship was on high alert, the constant threat of a Vex snap aggression wearing down their nerves. One of her tactical officers, a young lieutenant named Anya Sharma, had been at her post for 36 hours straight, tracking Vex energy fluctuations. Commander Sharma reported, her voice strained. A Vex probe is detaching from the gilded scale. It's moving towards the horizon. Fast! Red alert, Eva commanded, her voice cutting through the fatigue. Shields to full. Hail them. Warn them off. The probe was a small, dart-like vessel. It ignored the hails. It was not a weapon, but an inspection drone designed to scan the horizon's systems. The Vex were looking for a new excuse, a new violation to justify their actions. Perhaps a life support system failing a breach of their quarantine they could use as a pretext. The desperate do not care for rules, only for excuses. It's not stopping, Sharma said, her hands flying over her console. It's going to make an invasive scan. It could damage the horizon's outer hull. We can't fire on it. Jian said, his jaw tight. That would be a direct violation. We don't have to, Eva said. She looked at Sharma. Lieutenant, what's the probe's projected path? It will pass within 50 meters of our forward port emitter array. Then give it a little push, Eva ordered. Not with weapons, a gravimetric pulse, just enough to nudge it off course. Gently. It was a delicate, precise maneuver. A burst of focused gravity not strong enough to be considered a weapon, but enough to alter the probe's trajectory. Sharma's fingers danced, and the judgment sent out a whisper of force. The probe caught, unexpectedly tumbled. Its course shifted, sending it spinning directly into the path of one of the Vex escort ships. The escort's shields flared as it vaporized its own drone. It was a masterful piece of flying, a perfect, non-violent deflection. But the Vex escort ship, its systems likely on an automated hair trigger, registered the shield impact as a hostile act. In a flash of misplaced logic, one of its defensive turrets fired a single low-power plasma bolt. It was not aimed at the judgment, but at the source of the gravimetric pulse. It struck the judgment's forward emitter array, the one Anya Sharma was controlling. The console exploded in a shower of sparks. The smell of burnt ozone and plastic filled the bridge. When the smoke cleared, Lieutenant Sharma was slumped over her station, a deep gash on her forehead. Her uniform scorched. She was alive, but she was injured. A cost had been paid. The first blood had been drawn not in a battle, but in a legal argument that had finally boiled over into violence. A single drop of blood can outweigh a mountain of gold. The adjudicator Prime 7, which had been a silent observer, now pulsed with an angry crimson light. The Vex had crossed a line. They had responded to a non-violent defensive maneuver with force and had injured a Terran officer in the process. The entire legal framework of their quarantine was now shattered. The Vex Imperium, the adjudicator's voice thundered across all channels, has violated the terms of engagement. Their quarantine is declared illegal. Their use of force unprovoked. They will stand down immediately. But Eva was not finished. The injury to her officer, the tangible cost of this fight, had crystallized her resolve. It was not enough to simply win. It was not enough to be right. Justice had to be done. A price had to be exacted for every second of terror the colonists had endured, for every drop of blood spilled on her bridge. "Magister," she said, her voice like Arctic ice. "The ledger. What is the Vex's current debt?" 17.2 quadrillion credits, Commander. Is that amount sufficient to place a lien on a sovereign vessel under concordant law? There was a moment of pure focused computation. Affirmative, Commander. The debt now exceeds the audited asset value of the arbitrator-class vessel, Gilded Scale. Eva looked at the main screen at the obsidian form of the ship that had caused so much pain. "Then do it," she commanded. "File a lien. In the name of Lieutenant Anya Sharma and the 20,000 souls on the horizon, seize their ship, legally." It was the final perfect move, the ultimate mirror. The Vex had come to claim 10% of a human colony as payment for a debt. The humans would now claim 100% of the Vex flagship as payment for a debt of their own creation. The galaxy watched, utterly transfixed, as the public ledger updated. A new entry appeared in blazing red letters, lien filed. Asset Vex Imperium vessel Gilded Scale. You came to collect a tithe and forfeited an empire. For Arbiter Vask, this was the end. Its ship, its command, legally belonged to the creatures it had so arrogantly underestimated. To fight would be to become pirates, to be hunted by the Concordat's own enforcement fleets. To flee would be to abandon a priceless military asset and admit defeat. The Vex had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and outlawyered. They had built a weapon out of the law, and the humans had turned that weapon and used it to commit a perfect bloodless regicide. The Vex fleet did not move for a full hour. It was the silence of a defeated monarch, considering its abdication. Then slowly, painfully, the shields on the Gilded Scale and its escorts lowered. A single terse message was sent to the adjudicator. We concede. The quarantine field collapsed. The path to the stars was open. The Vex had not only lost the case, they had lost their flagship, their public standing, and the legal doctrine that had been the engine of their empire for 1,000 years. The adjudicator's final ruling was swift and absolute. The doctrine of imposed obligation was declared incompatible with the Concordat's Charter on Sentient Rights and was struck from the Galactic Legal Code. The Rostova precedent was formally entered, establishing that the potential of a sentient life could never be treated as a collateral asset. The Vex's lien on the horizon was voided. The human's lien on the gilded scale was upheld. The bridge of the judgment was quiet. There were no cheers this time, only a deep, bone-weary sense of relief. Eva walked over to the tactical station, where a medical team was stabilizing Lieutenant Sharma. The young officer was conscious, her eyes finding Eva's. "Did we win, Commander?" she whispered. Eva placed a hand on her shoulder. "We did, Lieutenant." "You did." The cost was a scar on a brave officer's face. The victory was a new line in the law books that would protect trillions of souls yet unborn. It was a trade she would make again, but the weight of it would stay with her forever. The law was not a clean, sterile thing. It had a price paid in moments of terror and sacrifice. As the horizon finally began to move its colonists, sending a final, tearful message of thanks, Eva stood alone on her bridge. Magister projected the final entry on the public ledger for her to see. The Vex's debt was frozen, their surrender logged. A new line of text blinked at the bottom, a permanent amendment to galactic law now and forever. The court's beacon, which had burned for weeks in subspace, finally cooled. The mirror arrays of justice, which had reflected the Vex's own ugliness back at them, dimmed at last. The law is not a weapon. It is a shield. It is not a collar to bind the weak, but a ledger to count the cost of cruelty. We came here expecting to fight for our lives, but instead we fought for a principle. We taught the galaxy that the human spirit is not an asset to be assessed, that a soul has no price, and that the first and only payment for an act of kindness must be gratitude, nothing more. The debt is now paid, and the books are balanced. The ledger is closed.